For our Global Citizenship Project for March, Lauren and I decided to discuss Obama and his trip to Cuba. Before we get in to discuss his trip to Cuba, I first want to introduce you guys to a video that briefly describes what Obama did over his trip.
Canadians who've been to Cuba may recognize not only all the great old cars they have here, but this building, the Capitol building here in Havana, which doesn't look an awful lot like one in Washington. Well, it does, and that's by design, and it underlines the super close relationship these two countries had for many years before things went downhill in the late 50s and early 60s, which is what Barack Obama is hoping to reverse with this trip, which begins when he arrives here in Havana for the historic first visit of a U.S. president to Cuba in nearly 90 years. Light schedule today. He's going to go to the cathedral here in Havana and then do kind of a walkabout here in old Havana. He's going to see some of the old cars. He's going to meet Cuban people, have some Cuban coffee. The real meat of this trip is Monday and Tuesday. Tomorrow he's going to meet face-to-face with Raul Castro, not Fidel Castro, but Fidel's brother Raul, who is the current president. They're going to talk about things. They're going to have a joint statement, state dinner tomorrow night, and then the key part of Barack Obama's visit on Tuesday, a televised address to the Cuban people in which he is going to push for more human rights, push for more freedom of expression and freedom of press, but be careful not to be seen to be the bully, kind of the U.S. forcing its way and urging regime change. That is not a part of the Obama plan, simply to suggest it in the hopes that the Cuban people, and we've talked to people here since we've been here, they want this. The hope is that it kind of catches on and the people here continue to press forward as well. The trip will end with, this is Cuba, a baseball game. Barack Obama is going to go to the Tampa Bay Rays, going to play the Cuban national team. We were watching them practice yesterday. I talked to one of the players. I said, so who do you think is going to win? Who do you want to win? And the guy says, hopefully both teams, which you could say is the way Barack Obama and Raul Castro might answer the question about this visit broadly in terms of the two countries, that they would hope it's a win for the U.S. and a win for Cuba. Paul Hunter, CBC News, Havana.
As the video stated, it's been about 90 years since a U.S. president has been to Cuba, or a U.S. sitting president. He's the first sitting president to go to Cuba since Calvin Coolidge went back in January of 1928. Obama landed in Cuba on March 20th, 2016. If you do the math, this is 88 years between these two presidential visits. These two visits were vastly different from one another. When Coolidge went to Cuba, he actually had to travel on a railway car to Key West, and this railway car did not have the luxury of air conditioning. And then after he arrived in Key West, he then moved to a battleship, the USS Texas, to make the remainder of his journey. And the total time spent traveling to Cuba was about 3 whole days. If you notice the picture on the left, you'll see Calvin Coolidge and his wife during their historic visit to Cuba. So let's compare Calvin Coolidge's journey to Cuba versus Obama's journey to Cuba. Obama was able to travel to Cuba in a luxurious Air Force One, which is way different from a non-air-conditioned railway car and a battleship. And it only took Obama 3 hours to get to Cuba, where it took Calvin Coolidge 3 whole days. In fact, Obama actually mentioned this in one of his speeches, and he said that he compared how it took Calvin Coolidge 3 whole days, while it only took him 3 hours. As I'm sure you're all very aware of, the USA and Cuba haven't had the best of relationship. So Obama's visit to Cuba is absolutely historic. It all started during the Cold War and Fidel Castro's revolution in Cuba. You had Eisenhower placing an embargo on Cuba, you had the failed attempt of the Bay of Pigs, and of course you had the infamous Cuban Missile Crisis. The U.S. has actually had 50 years of sanctions, and then they had diplomatic issues with Cuba. So it is a huge deal that Obama went to visit this communistic country. Let's talk a little bit about Cuba. This is a fact I found to be very interesting. The runway that President Obama landed on with Air Force One was actually the same runway that the CIA bombed in the 1960s. When Obama and his family landed in Cuba, they were greeted by Bruno Rodriguez, which is the Cuban foreign minister. Of course, as you all know from the video, Obama was there for 3 days, and he was really there to fix the relationship with Cuba and emphasize the need of human rights. I'm going to break down a little bit about Obama's trip. First on Obama's agenda was to visit with the diplomats working at the fairly newly opened U.S. Embassy. It was opened in 2014, and this is a huge deal as well. Obama was taking a tour of Havana, Cuba, and he went to a local museum, and on his way there were actually chants by the Cuban people saying USA, USA, so this is quite a big deal. His plan started with, on Monday, he met with Raul Castro, which of course is the brother of the infamous Fidel Castro. On Tuesday, Obama addressed Cuban people, and to wrap up his trip, Obama went to a baseball game with his family. All his trip information came from USA Today's article, President Obama Touches Down in Cuba, Launching History-Making Visit. Many people would agree that the highlight of Obama's trip was definitely when he addressed the needs of human rights to the communistic Cubans. And this was definitely a huge achievement of his trip. Obama was quoted as saying, "Every person should be equal under the law. Citizens should be free to speak their mind without fear, to organize and to criticize their government, and to protest peacefully, and that the rule of law should not include arbitrary detentions of people who exercise those rights." This quote comes from What's Good, Bad, and Ugly About Obama's Cuba Trip by The Federalist. Of course, Obama's trip to Cuba was not without its fair share of controversy. Although Obama's visit to Cuba did have its fair share of achievements, there were also some major problems. One of the main problems of Obama's visit is that he legitimized Castro's rule by visiting Cuba and talking to Raul Castro. This legitimized the Castro family ruling in Cuba. Another problem is that individuals were actually repressed by Castro's security shortly after Obama's speech on human rights, and these individuals were talking about their human rights when the security came to get them. Lastly, Obama was at a baseball game after the ISIS attack in Brussels, and many Americans found this to be a huge problem. So, after hearing all this research, the achievements, and the problems, what do you guys think? Do you think it was a good idea that Obama went to Cuba? Lauren and I were thinking of ways to incorporate this into the classroom, and we thought that you could have the students debate whether it was a good idea or whether it was a bad idea. We were thinking of 2 North Carolina teaching candidate standards that would fit in this lesson. The first standard is Standard 2, which says teachers establish a respectful environment for a diverse population of students. It is important that if you have a debate going on in your class, that you have the students respect each other's opinions. Finally, there is Standard 4D, which says that teachers integrate and utilize technology in their instruction. For the debate, you could have students research some of the achievements and some of the problems of Obama's historic visit to Cuba. Lauren and I hope you have enjoyed our March Global Citizenship Project, and we look forward to hearing what you guys have to say.